my new best friend.
Superhero movies have come a long way, haven't they? They're now this big cinematic universe package, or I guess in this case, two big packages, that now have become the biggest box office franchises of all time. But before any of that happened, there was one character that went through franchise hell and back in multiple occasions, and that one was Spider-Man. But how did it exactly go through franchise hell? Well, in the late 90s, Marvel was going through bankruptcy. They needed multiple companies to buy their properties and their characters so that they can survive in entertainment as a whole. And of course, those characters spread across through many companies in the film industry. This of course prompted these companies to make movie adaptations of these characters, which in of itself was a huge financial risk at the time. Why? Because in the 90s, superhero movies were pretty much at their absolute worst. With movies like Batman and Robin, Steel, Fantastic Four in 1994, Captain America, these are some of the worst comic book adaptations in history. Therefore, releasing another one at just any point in time was still risky. But there was a ray of hope that happened in the late 90s, with Blade coming out in 1998, that pretty much saved everything. Following up with that, in 2000 was X-Men. And then, finally, the crowning achievement of all that success was, of course, Spider-Man. In celebration of the new release of the fourth MCU Spider-Man entry, let's talk about Spider-Man's movie history, shall we? The first Spider-Man trilogy was all directed by Evil Dead director Sam Raimi. That's a bit of a transition. I mean, I can't imagine going from that to this, but somehow he made it work. And while Blade was one of the first solo Marvel films to ever get the ball rolling in terms of success, Spider-Man would keep that ball rolling from there on, and inspire so many other films to also create their own solo films like The Hulk or Daredevil. But while those two weren't as successful, Spider-Man would basically be number one pretty much all the time. But what made Spider-Man so special mostly has due to the casting as well as the direction of the entire production, making it look like a unique comic book feel without actually being too close to comfort when it comes to adapting to the comics. It's still trying to be its own thing without actually taking away from what people love the character so much for. The fact that he's just your everyday normal guy just trying to fit into the world, and then he's been given the superpowers, teaching himself great power, great responsibility, and all that kind of thing. And I think what makes it work is the casting. Tobey Maguire as Peter Parker is honestly a perfect casting choice. He has a normal sounding voice. He's not uberly Calvin Klein type of attractive. He's just well enough of a normal looking human being that you can easily relate to. But when you do see a pretty face, it's usually with the love interest, which Kirsten Dunst is practically perfect for. Even though she is a DID most of the time, she still offers a decent performance from Kirsten Dunst as an actress. But even though in my opinion it's a lesser extent to her acting ability, it's still a decent choice. Rosemary Harris, who somehow is still alive to this day, is of course my favorite Aunt May in the entire series of movies. She has an immense amount of wisdom and something that not only the hero can relate to, but something we can all relate to. It's like her extended grandmother in a way. Of course, the villains, with Willem Dafoe as Green Goblin and Alfred Molina as Doc Ock, also have great performances in their entries as well. And of course, it does get a little silly and cartoony in most of these films. At the very most, it still gives us what we'd expect from these comic book adaptations. Even though it doesn't take itself 100% seriously, at the same time, it gives us exactly what we would want to see in a comic book adaptation. And that's just something that we don't normally see even nowadays. And that's probably why we celebrate these movies even to this day. It's unfortunate though that the trilogy was supposed to have a fourth installment, but because of the not so promising success of the third movie, it left Sony kind of iffy in thinking that they needed to continue this. The problem with that is that it wasn't even Sam Raimi's fault. It was Sony's. Sam Raimi simply just wanted the third one to be just about Peter Parker dealing with the killer who killed his uncle. Is he gonna take revenge against the guy? Is he gonna kill the guy? You don't really know what's gonna happen. But when he gets tainted by the black suit, he ultimately becomes his worst enemy against his worst enemy. But what makes that so interesting is that they're both in the course of losing something. Peter went through the loss of his uncle, but also potentially going through the loss of his own love life with Mary Jane. And Flint, who's the Sandman, is going through a weird time trying to give his daughter the best life that he can, ironically committing to these criminal acts in order to do that. There's this really awesome scene that really shows that visually when he turns into the Sandman when he's trying to pick up the locket of his daughter, but for some reason he can't pick it up because he's covered in sand. It's kind of like showing that his life is falling apart, but when he hardens his hand, he can actually pick up the locket, which kind of gives us the solution to put his life together. And that's such a powerfully emotional scene that I wish some of the rest of the film was like in terms of that level of creativity. The only problem is Sony stepped in to be all corporate, adding another villain that didn't honestly need to be there, which gave birth to one of the worst entries of this entire franchise, Topher Grace as Venom / Eddie Brock. Nothing against Topher Grace or anything, but this isn't one of the best as on-screen adaptations of this character. I mean, I'll take the cartoons or even Ultimate Spider-Man any day, but I don't know if this is better or worse. This or the Venom trilogy. Either way, it didn't need to be there, and it's a huge distraction from what already was an interesting entry to the franchise. And what made things worse on top of that was that there was supposed to be a fourth one, but Sam Raimi couldn't deliver on the script on time, therefore the fourth movie couldn't be created at that point. When word got out that Disney was going to buy the entirety of Marvel, Sony wasn't exactly responding very well. Because of course that means they would potentially lose their rights to the Spider-Man properties, and they didn't want to give it away so easily. And with the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe just arising, with the first Iron Man to the first Hulk to the first Thor, and then eventually to the first Captain America, it was only inevitable to the point where they're about to lose everything. But they weren't going to give up just yet. Instead, Sony decided they wanted to reboot the franchise in order to maintain the properties. Since they only had 5 years to keep the properties on their own, they at least gave themselves the chance to at least keep the rights for as long as they can so that they can keep making money with the property. And that gave birth to one of the strangest choices they could possibly make, rebooting the franchise. I'm not sure why they thought this was a good idea. I think they should have just kept going with the original trilogy that they were already doing and get Sam Raimi back to make the fourth movie. And say, like, we're sorry we didn't believe in your script. We'll try again. We'll give you as much time as you need, although we only have 5 or 10 years left until we have to get the properties away. But we can still do this. We can still do this, right? So instead of them continuing the Spider-Man franchise, they instead start all over again with The Amazing Spider-Man. Instead of starring Tobey Maguire, it's Andrew Garfield. Now, Andrew Garfield as an actor has always been a plus when it comes to his movies. He's never had a miss in terms of his films, except for maybe this one, which I know has a big audience, but this is a weird thing to do with this character. And it gives us a watered down version of what we already had. And what makes it so sloppy is that it's trying to pick itself back up, despite it doing such a poor job in trying to keep itself together. I'm not saying they're not trying, but it's like trying to build a Lego set with broken pieces. It's even more annoying with the audience because they were already attached to the Tobey Maguire movies. So why would you transition to something completely different that nobody really asked for? It's kind of like looking for an audience that wasn't there in the first place. Why didn't you just kept what you were doing before? It just doesn't make sense. But how do these movies actually fare? Well, they're not the greatest. As far as Spider-Man movies go, these are definitely the worst ones of all the Spider-Man movies. And I know there's an audience for these movies, but at the same time, I don't even know if it was worth going through all that trouble. Clearly, this is just a desperate attempt to try to keep the rights, but it's such a lousy attempt to keep that. And it clearly shows just based on how the writing is. It's basically a rushed, watered-down version of what was already fine on its own. There's not really much to say about these films, they're just not very good. So despite the failure of a franchise, Sony still wasn't willing to give up the rights to Disney. So Disney decided to make a compromise with Sony and decided to share the rights with the Spider-Man properties while also trying to transition it into the MCU. Sony reluctantly agreed to the partnership, hence allowing Spider-Man to be part of the MCU indefinitely. With his first appearance in the MCU's Captain America Civil War, he goes on to his own trilogy, including a fourth, along with being in Avengers Infinity War and Endgame. Pretty much his stamps his approval of being in the MCU while allowing Sony to maintain the rights of the character. So in a way, they didn't really lose anything, but clearly they haven't gotten over the fact that they can't use Spider-Man to their own free will. So to make up for that, they decided to make a cinematic universe of their own without Spider-Man by adding Spider-Man villains instead, which is honestly more pathetic than making Amazing Spider-Man. I don't even understand how they can be so stingy with the character anyway. I think it's just kind of a weird choice. The unique partnership that Sony has with Disney allows them to have this character in the MCU while also trying to keep the character alive mostly for audiences to grasp onto. And as far as the movies go, while they're not as good as the original Sam Raimi trilogy, they're probably the most consistent in terms of MCU trilogies. Then they're a lot of fun to watch. It's nice to see like an actual young character to play a Spider-Man who is typically supposed to be a young character. That's the issue I had with Andrew Garfield. He just wasn't young enough to just be convincing as a Peter Parker or a Spider-Man. Because Spider-Man is supposed to be a teenager, a young kid. And Tom Holland fits this perfectly. Even though it embodies so much of MCU slop, let's be honest, it's mostly slop, it's still fun to watch. It's not like the characters are unlikable or anything, and the movies themselves are still fun to watch. My favorite one personally being No Way Home. I don't know if it's going to measure out with Brand New Day since I haven't really seen it yet. But the fact that these movies have been just as consistent, and now that the fourth movie has already reached $927 million in its first weekend, which is insane, it's clear as day that the audience never left, but I think it's more so the audience with the people that were already with the MCU for the longest time for the past almost 20 years up to this point. I think that's probably why people went to go see this movie. I think the reason why I'm making this video is simply because this is probably the most interesting history in terms of Marvel products that's ever been concocted throughout the entirety of Hollywood's interest in making these superhero movies. And Spider-Man was probably the biggest one to ever have such a huge staple in the entertainment industry as a whole. It's the one character that never leaves people's heads, even if you haven't even been fully exposed to these films. That's just how big of an impact this character has had. And if you made it to the end of this video, you're probably wondering why I've never talked about the Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse movies. Well, that's a whole other thing that deserves its own video. A video that I'll make as soon as the final entry of the Spider-Verse trilogy comes out, which isn't until next summer. So until then, that will be its own video. Plus, I'm also going to be doing the cosplay thing again that I did 2 years ago when Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse came out. And that's going to be a pretty interesting video on its own. But those would be like two separate things. The long grueling history that went through making these films is something really interesting in its own right.